Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast, brought to you by City Current and powered by Lipscomb and Pitts Insurance. This show shares personal stories and insight from those who are giving back and making a difference, so we can learn and do the same. We cover life lessons, business advice, passion, and purpose. Now here's our host, Jeremy Park.
Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're in for a treat talking about science, technology, and education, all the above. We have a changemaker here in the Nashville, Middle Tennessee area who's not only creating change here, but I think when you look at what they're doing, it's going to have a global impact. We have Steve Hinkley, President and CEO of the Adventure Science Center. So Steve, how are you doing?
We're doing great. Thank you very much. Thanks for having us, Jeremy.
Absolutely. So the fun of this is we get to cover a little bit of your life story and especially leading to what you're doing today. And then we'll talk obviously a lot about what you're doing not only today, but for tomorrow. That's kind of the fun of this. But give us a little backstory in terms of just where you grew up, and let's start there.
Yeah, well, I grew up a little bit all over. I like to say I'm sort of a university brat. My dad was a university professor, and so we moved around a little bit with his job. But ultimately, when I think back to where I grew up, it was Austin, Texas. That's where my family was for about 15 years. And I was fortunate to call that city home from 1983 until the mid-90s. And it was a lot of what defined me as a person in a number of ways. It was a great culture, great place to grow up. Certainly had a wonderful exposure to music.
Yeah, I was going to say great music and film. Yeah. And so cowboy boots, do you wear cowboy boots?
I don't, but I did have a pair of
there you go.
Skin cowboy boots for a number of years.
And then for Texas barbecue, it's usually brisket or
yes.
So
yeah, it's very different from what we get here in Nashville. Yeah. But I miss it, but have learned to love Nashville very much. And there are actually a lot of similarities between the cultures of the cities, but also just what is happening in terms of the growth and sort of that exponential change that's taking place in Nashville. And we might sort of sometimes benchmark ourselves as a city a little bit, kind of where Austin was maybe 5-10 years ago, but it's really very similar in a lot of ways.
Nice. So carry that forward. So growing up obviously in Austin, and then talk about just kind of where you went to college and leading into the next step.
So I went to college at Tufts University up in Boston and had a degree in biology, was planning to go to medical school, and then realized that just was not going to be the trajectory for me. So I went straight into teaching and went and taught middle school for a few years and then taught high school for about 6 years after that. All told, had a 10-year career in the classroom teaching biology, physics, and anatomy and physiology. And that was a really wonderful moment for me. I had the good fortune of having great teachers when I was a young kid, and particularly my 5th grade science teacher, Ms. Kimball, was the one that had probably the biggest impact on me. And she really instilled in me a love of science and a desire to share that with others. And so fundamentally, that's ultimately what has defined my entire professional career. When I think about the work that I did in the classroom and then how that transferred ultimately into working in a science center, it's all about a love for science and wanting to share that with everybody else, period. And that drives all of that work. And
it's pretty amazing that you can kind of pinpoint it back to that. I mean, especially as a teacher, because many times as teachers, you never know the impact that you're having. And yet to this point, I mean, that completely changed the trajectory and your thought of what you're doing today.
It did. Maybe not at that time, but over time, and sometimes that's the beauty of those impact moments. Yeah. We don't know the latency of when that ultimately takes effect. But for me, it started to really take hold in high school. I had another great science teacher in high school, and that really solidified it for me, so that by the time I went to college, I knew one way or another I was going down the science and the natural science track, and it sort of led to this place. So I taught school for 10 years, and then at the end of that, I chose to leave the profession. I felt like year over year things were starting to become a bit repetitive, and the last thing that I wanted to be was that teacher in the classroom that really wasn't thrilled to be there every day. And so I left and traveled the world for about a year and a half, and then was very fortunate to get a phone call kind of out of the blue from a former student's father who served on the Museum of Science Board in Dallas, Texas. And he said, "We've got an education role opening up here. Would you be interested in that?" And so I put my name in the hat, and that started my career in science museums, and I've been there ever since. So since 2007, I've worked with science museums, 3 of them now, and it's been just a fantastic way to extend that passion again of loving science and sharing it with others, and being able to really have a huge impact in the community.
Well, from Dallas to Santa Barbara, and obviously now in Nashville, talk about, because especially within Dallas and Nashville are probably more similar than maybe Santa Barbara, but talk about, what it's like to step in and look at things, especially as kind of a newcomer in, and say, okay, how do we create a new vision, a new platform, and yet be able to expand? And we'll talk a lot about just the industry and how it's changing and the interactivity and technology. I mean, there's so many nuances that we'll definitely cover, but just talk about stepping in, especially from a teaching background, and starting to lay a new vision, especially there in Dallas.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there are probably a number of different ways in which that manifested itself, but fundamentally, science centers, museums, they're storytellers, right? And some of them are creating new knowledge and information through research and their collections, but somehow they've got to translate that into a way that the public can relate to it. And that was so much of what teaching was about, right? It was about taking very complex ideas and finding a way to distill those into something that young children who were for the very first time ever hearing about these ideas could at least grasp onto some part of it enough to give them a leg up into ultimately having a mastery of that content. And that's exactly what the Science Center is about in many ways. It's about finding these big, wonderful, amazing, complex ideas and distilling them down into their essence so that anybody can relate to them. And that's the challenge, but that's the beauty of it too, is when you find that moment, just the same as it is in that classroom where it clicks and you just see that understanding happen in a guest is really remarkable. And then you've done your job. So
right.
So that is really fundamentally what it was all about is how do we take these wonderful ideas and tell stories about them to engage people, to inspire them, and to some extent inform them, although I would say that that's one of the big differences between being in a classroom and being in a science museum, is that at the science museum it's more about inspiring them and getting them captivated and passionate about an idea versus mastering the content specifically. That's less of what science centers are focused on, in my view. There are others who would have a very different view of that
Sure.
thing, but from our perspective, at the Adventure Science Center, it's not so much about making sure that content X from nuts to bolts all the way through the higher structure. It's really making sure that you relate to it in a way that you love and maybe want to explore it further on your own.
Share, and before we talk a lot about Adventure Science Center, share with us maybe one kind of neat accomplishment or just something that put a smile on your face with Dallas and Santa Barbara, and then we'll jump to what you're doing today.
That is also a really big question. There were so many fantastic moments in both of those experiences that I could point back to. A number of them are the relationships in the communities that you form that really are special and non-repeatable from place to place, and that's what makes each science center totally unique. But if it's sort of coming down to the opening days that we did in Dallas and the opening day in Santa Barbara were phenomenal. It was just such a wonderful celebration of the community that had rallied behind these amazing projects. And then you spend a lot of your time as you're building towards these huge structures. It's in Dallas, it was a $190 million capital campaign that took place over almost 10 years, well, more than 10 years. In Santa Barbara, a smaller campaign, but that project actually had been in a development cycle for almost 30 years.
Wow.
And so to get to that culminating point where you get to reward the folks that have been a part of that since the beginning, and you get to then stop talking about this thing and show it to people and let them be a part of it and experience it firsthand and with their hands, that's just an amazing moment. It's emotional and it's extraordinary. So that's probably the highlight of those two things. In and among that, there are all kinds of really fun, great moments with the people, but then also you get to develop these really cool exhibits that no one's ever built before, and so you're kind of out on this technology limb and you're experimenting
pushing the boundaries,
with
right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
You really are, and sometimes you're totally pushing the boundaries of what the exhibit companies themselves have done, and that's when you really know you're in that fun space, because when they feel like it's something they've never done before, you know that you're leading the way within that industry, and that's a fun place to be.
So I've spent a lot of time in Santa Barbara, and what in the world attracted you? So to draw you from Santa Barbara and that gorgeous weather and coastline, obviously there's something special in the water here in Nashville and Middle Tennessee, but what attracted you and your family to this this new opportunity to be the president and CEO with the Adventure Science Center?
It was a number of things. Certainly being closer to our original roots. My wife is from Texas, Dallas and Houston. I was from Austin. So there's a lot of it culturally that we felt comfortable coming back to this part of the world. Her family is in Texas, and so it was nice to be closer to, for us parents, and then for our kids, their grandparents, and so that was wonderful. But then, a lot of it was just the draw of what the potential for the Adventure Science Center could become. And when you look at Nashville, Certainly it's gone through a tremendous growth trajectory of the last 5, 10, 15 years, but I still think it's at the very bottom of that curve. And when we think about the Science Center and its role in the community, what it can be in relation to what Nashville is in terms of how it presents itself as a sort of its own community, but then also within the relative scope of world-class cities, it's tremendous what Nashville's capable of, and we want to be a part of that, and the Science Center should be a part of that. I have a hard time personally when I see a Science Center that's not living up to what I think it really could be in terms of the potential to impact many lives, not just kids but adults, and inspire them and transform the way that they think about the world. And the Science Center, to me, needed to live up to that in a different way, and so I was very eager to come out and help go through that transformation with the Science Center, with the board, with the staff, and really make this the greatest science center on the planet.
So you stepped in June of 2017, so last year. So at this point, you're over a year in. Talk about laying that new vision and some of the pieces that you've been able to kind of put in, and then we'll talk a lot about just some of the things that are, to me, changes not only within the museum, but also changes within, it's not really a museum, it's a center, it's an active center, but within the industry as a whole, because I think it's really cool how technology is changing the landscape of how people interact and what you can do with them, to your point.
It is, yeah, it definitely is, and would love to talk more about that. Certainly, it's been it's a lot of the conversation that we have about what that future for us looks like. But in terms of setting that new vision, there's really kind of a mix. There are certain ideas that I have right off the bat. Some of those need to be kind of tested against what the community is interested in, but a lot of it, quite frankly, over the last year has just been listening. It's listening to my staff, it's listening to the board, getting out to introduce myself to the community and listen to what they're interested in. One of the things that's been very apparent is the content areas in the Science Center don't always reflect what Nashville has kind of as a priority set of values. And what I mean by that is music and sound, which obviously is central to the identity of Nashville. It's not a topic area that we've really explored in depth until now, and that's one of the big reasons that we're moving towards developing a music and sound exhibit is really to reflect that core identity of Nashville. But it's not just music and sound. There's a lot more to this city and this community, Middle Tennessee, than just music, right? You've got sports, you've got healthcare, you've got construction, engineering, you've got automotive and mobility. Those are all huge stories that I think we're underrepresenting within our space. I think we've done a nice job over the last several years with some of the healthcare pieces, but that can always be updated. There are different formats and different stories that we can tell. But those 5 core areas, I think, will be a lot of that key to the future of what the Adventure Science Center talks about, and the stories that it leverages. So setting the vision has been a lot of listening, and then finally, after a number of months, I kind of roughed out this sort of broad set of 4 points that we aspire to be. The first one is we want to be the best science center in the world for visitors of all ages. The second part is we want to be the must-see destination for Nashville and Tennessee. Nashville sees 15.5 million visitors every single year, and they stay an average of just over 3 days. There's ample time for them to come spend time at the Science Center, especially since a number of them are really focused on that downtown space. And when you think about family institutions in that downtown area, there's not a lot. The Adventure Science Center is really that big player within that space. And we have an opportunity really to engage that set of the public, not just the folks that are living within 50, 60 miles of our front doors. The third part of the vision for us is to be a regional powerhouse and really to be have a regional presence and a hub for science and innovation. So the way that we define that is from our front door, we look about 200 miles out in all directions. And we think, okay, there's a space there that nobody has really dominated in terms of aggregating those cool stories around science, technology, and innovation, and they are everywhere. There's an extraordinary depth of those kinds of ideas, but no one's really aggregating that and helping shine a light on those super cool opportunities. And that's a missed chance. And part of the reason that I say that is because these are organizations that really should be highlighted. They should be proud of what they do. And there's a lot of really cool things that are coming out of Middle Tennessee that are changing the way the world works. Similarly, for particularly the young audiences in our community who are wondering what that future looks like for them, although we know it's increasingly going to depend on science and technology, us being a regional hub for a lot of that storytelling means that those families, those kids now can come to us and they can see, oh, okay, in 15, 20 years when I'm looking for a career, this is a really cool space to play in. And again, we think about those 5 content areas: the music and sound, construction engineering, automotive, and sports and health. Those are industries that are not going away from Middle Tennessee at all. So let's figure out how we can inspire those kids to get involved with those now. And a way to do that is to engage those organizations within 200 miles and bring their stories into the Science Center and convey that to the guests that are coming through our doors every single day. The fourth part of that vision is to help really create that next generation of creative, collaborative problem solvers. That speaks a lot to the work that we do with teachers and the young children within the school districts as a way to help support the instruction that happens in the classroom, but also give those kids a real different vision of what they can be in the future. That's a big part of it. So it's been a lot of fun to refine that, to talk with the board, to talk with the community, to bounce it off of other folks, and then really sort of resolve. Those are the 4 big points that we want to accomplish in the next 10 years.
But I hope listeners have just hearing you talk about that, one, how articulate you are in terms of presenting that, but I hope listeners gain an appreciation for the strategic element of everything you're talking about, right? Is, one, obviously being strategic in terms of listening and taking that advice in and saying, okay, I want to come in and get a lay of the land and understand and figure out where those gaps are that we might be either underserving or not serving, but have an opportunity to serve better or serve in. And then also, too, how do you connect all those dots? And so back to strategy at all levels, everything you're talking about is it goes to leadership, but it's also very, very strategic, which I think is so important when you're talking about creating change and getting buy-in and doing these things. Strategy is so important, and I hope listeners kind of pick up on everything you're talking about.
It is, and sorry, I'll just ping pong off that, but also so is relevance. And that's one of the things when I look at science museums or really cultural institutions in general, often the most successful ones are the ones that reflect the values of their community.
Right.
And so when we think about those content areas, it's strategic, certainly from getting them involved, but it's also, at the end of the day, we're a nonprofit. We rely on folks coming through our doors and buying tickets in order for us to be able to sustain and develop that mission. And if we're not relevant to what their interests already are, then we're going to struggle. And furthermore, at the end of the day, we're helping them see the science in the everyday life. Anybody that drives around Middle Tennessee, you'll come across some aspect of mobility, you'll come across some aspect of sports, healthcare. You can't miss these things, right? And so this is a way for us to talk about those ideas so that when people leave the Science Center, they're still connected to them. And so we aren't separate from the community. We're deeply, deeply enmeshed in it.
Talk about technology, because I know this is a game changer when you talk about museums, centers, anything that's interactive. People nowadays, especially kids, they want to be able to touch and interact. And you're seeing even now places like Universal Studios. We were there over spring break, and everything now is kind of that 4D or 3D. We're putting the glasses and Spider-Man's jumping out at you. But it's changing the expectation. So to your point about relevance, it's changing the expectation in terms of using technology to teach, but also to be immersed within an environment. So talk about from your standpoint of embracing technology and utilizing it in a way that is relevant.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that we consider quite a lot, especially as we're going through any kind of exhibit or education program development. One of the things that I freely share is anyone asks, who's your biggest competitor? Who are your competitors in the community? And it's not another institution. It's the phone. It's the tablet. It's the computer. That's the competition. Because over the last 10 years in particular, the way that we've defined an interactive, an immersive experience, a social, collaborative experience, has completely changed based on the technology that's readily available to almost every single person in this country. So that's our biggest competitor. So as we look at that world of exhibit development, we look at it really through the lens of how can we create things that are so different from what people could have in their hands at any given time, and that guides a lot of our thinking. That being said, we don't run away from technology. We totally embrace it, partly because people are more familiar with it, so it gives us a little more opportunities to use technology now, whereas 10, 15, 20 years ago, if you were to put virtual reality into someone's hands, the technology wasn't really all that great and stable at those points, but the other aspect is the learning curve to get folks to the point where they would know how to utilize it right off the bat was pretty high. That learning curve is a little less steep at this point, and more people have a familiarity and a comfort level with technology, and now you've got this whole generation of kids that are technology natives, and so it's instantaneous, their ability to grasp how to use those things. We try to be really careful about the application of technology in our exhibits and our education programs. We use it when it makes sense. We don't put technology in people's hands just for the sake of the kind of whiz bang and really cool factor, so to speak. We put it there where it makes sense, and I'll give a few examples of this. So within our Science Center, we've got a great makerspace that we're going to quadruple over the course of the next year in size. And in that makerspace, we have high technology, rapid prototyping equipment. We've got laser cutters, 3D printers, tablets, all these different kinds of things, and probably a ton of stuff that I'm not even aware of. They do some really cool cutting edge stuff in there. But there's also a spectrum of programming and interactive pieces that are deliberately low technology or even no technology. We pull out the crayons, glue, and scissors as frequently as we pull out the 3D printers. The reason for that is because at the end of the day, it depends on what we're trying to help people understand. If we want them to have an experience with 3D printing and the amazing world that has allowed, then of course it makes sense to utilize that technology. But if it's really more about walking people through that creative process of coming up with a new idea and then thinking about how they might go about creating that thing, we often defer away from technology, partly because that technology, again, even though the learning curve of that stuff is getting shorter and shorter, it can be an impediment. It can get in the way of what people are trying to learn if we want them to learn about the process of creative discovery. Mm-hmm. And we don't want that to be the case. We want technology to enable, not disable. So that's one area where we're very focused on that. On the exhibit side, you're right that there's been a huge transformative effect of technology in the Science Center space in particular. You'll see it also in art museums. You see it, art museums are embracing a lot of it because you can't touch the art, right? So technology often becomes that intermediary, that substitute for what people can physically interact with. But when we look at technology, and I'll use our upcoming exhibit Soundbox that will open next summer, that technology that is in that place is being specifically utilized for two reasons. One is it's utilized so that we can give people an experience of success very quickly where it would otherwise take them a long time to do it. So say, for example, I don't know if you know how to play the sitar, but we're developing, not many people in this community probably do, right? But one of the things that we're developing is an experience within that exhibit space where we can put a real sitar in your hands, and chances are you won't know how to play that, but that's okay. But we give you that sense of the real, the tangible. And then when you want to learn how to play the sitar, we put an augmented reality device in your hands. And that augmented reality device, when you look on a screen, it looks like you're holding a real sitar, but in fact you're just holding an augmented reality piece. But now as you move your hands across the augmented reality piece, it simulates the effect of you playing perfect music on a sitar. So although you've never picked one up in your entire life, perhaps, you look and sound like a pro.
Amazing sound of music. So can you do that for where I can play Bon Jovi songs on a guitar too?
Absolutely. Well, so that's the best part of
That'll make my wife really happy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then you can record that and take it home and make sure that she hears it every night. So the other fun part about that, and this speaks a lot to the use of technology, is it's malleable. And that's part of the beauty of it. Our boundaries are no longer physical in a lot of ways in terms of what that experience is. It's ones and zeros. It's software, and the software development is almost infinite in terms of that. So you could come back the next day and now you've got a guitar in your hands, or you come back the next day and you've got some other instrument that maybe you've never seen or heard of.
But even like the sitar, there's a piece of that's cultural relevance too. So in other words, you're teaching different cultures as a piece of this. So it's not just the music aspect, it's also the cultural aspect, which I think is a really cool piece of this too.
Yep, absolutely. And that's very deliberate for the Soundbox piece. We want to make sure that we're talking about music and sound in a global context, not just in terms of one genre or another. So yeah, it's a big deal. But that's a lot of how we're using technology is to create these flexible platforms where we can change the content frequently, which again goes back to when we think about ourselves as a regional hub for science and innovation. When we meet a new partner with music and sound, we can now develop something and plug them into an existing infrastructure. We don't have to change the entire infrastructure to make room for that story. And so it just gives us a lot more flexibility down the road in the platform. Exhibits often are going to be your most expensive and your slowest way to make change in terms of your storytelling in the science museum world. Programming, education programming, putting trained educators and docents and volunteers on the floor, that's pretty fast because they're human and they can adapt very quickly to the world of science, but they can also adapt very quickly to what you may or may not know about a particular topic. Exhibits are slow and they're kind of clunky in that way, but technology is changing that, and that's one of the cool things that we're embracing.
Well, it kind of leads into what I was going to ask you next anyway, is how much change can you create? In other words, when you look at the change of, okay, all of these things, well, obviously there's a cost associated, there's a timeline associated, but what ability can you change certain things? In other words, how fast can you move certain things that you want to move versus being cognizant of like the planning process and the implementation and the cost? I mean, there's so many nuances to what you have, to your point, to ultimately bringing something new in. Mm-hmm. So share a little bit of that kind of dynamic of creating the change, but the timelines that it's on, and how many different pieces like exhibits can you really change in a year? I mean, what are some of those nuances like?
And again, it will kind of depend on the nature of the exhibit, the scale of it. But it can be sort of slow. So, for example, Soundbox, which is 2,500 square feet of exhibits, 15 individual interactives in that space, that's really a development cycle of about 2 years. Whereas if you take a smaller element, the cycles can be shorter, the cost is going to be shorter. Generally speaking, when you're budgeting for exhibits, $500 to $600 a square foot is sort of what you're looking at. But that's another reason why it makes all the sense in the world to use as flexible a platform as you possibly can. And philosophically, my view of the exhibits is they really are kind of the fundamental experience. They're sort of if you want to think about it as a cake, they're the actual, just the cake batter. All of the frosting and those sorts of things are the education programs, a number of the other sort of changing experiences that add a different sort of sense of that experience, but they're not that fundamental core of what the exhibit experience is like. But we're able to make change on some of these things as much or as quickly as we really want to, especially if it's a technology-based platform. That way we invest early on in the infrastructure, in the technology, but that investment lasts a heck of a lot longer than creating a lot of furniture, so to speak.
Gotcha. Sure, I think you have an advantage coming from an education background and being a teacher, but talk about kind of aligning this within the, as you pointed out, you've got a lot of programmatic elements that align with teachers and schools. And so, once again, being cognizant and strategic of, okay, everything we do, not only does it have to be fun and relevant, but it has to fit within the curriculum and the education that goes along with it as well.
Yeah, and so we try to run this nice balance of aligning with the curriculum where we need to, so that teachers feel that the experience inside the Science Center has value in relation to what they're doing in the classroom. That being said, there's a whole other side of learning, as we sort of term this whole big, broad set of experiences. There's a whole other side of learning that we really emphasize, and we think that complements and dovetails really well with what happens in the formal classroom settings. And here's an easy way for me, hopefully, to try to explain this, is when we think about learning, we kind of look at it within 5 different areas. There's knowledge and skills, which is largely what the formal side of learning takes care of, is they're trying to teach kids, for example, how to use a microscope, or they're trying to teach them particular content pieces. Then there's a whole other side of learning that's much more affective. It's much more socio-emotional. Sometimes it's called non-cognitive, but I disagree with that term. It's highly cognitive. And those are engagements, attitudes, and behaviors. And largely what that speaks to is how does this experience of learning transform a person individually, and how does it change the way they behave? How does it change their attitude, their perception of themselves, but also their perception of the world of science and the world around them? And then does it ultimately change the course of their life? And so that's really where we play. So there's a little bit of the nod, certainly, to the formal side. And we do present content in our space. We're not to the point where we're not presenting content. We never will be. But that's not the key emphasis. For us, really, that biggest motivator is to give them changes in their engagement, attitudes, and behaviors. And quite frankly, I think that's one of the greatest values that we bring to the formal world of education. And it's one of the biggest reasons that I think teachers and students love to come to the Science Center. It's because they know that when they're there, it's an experience they'll never get again. It won't be one that they can repeat in the classroom. But it's also speaking to a very different part of them, who they are. It's speaking to a different part of their thinking, but it's speaking to a very different part of their emotional side. It's getting them to fall in love with what the content is and what those stories of science can be.
Well, I know that Tom Shadyac, who's a Hollywood producer, director, Liar, Liar, Ace Ventura, Nutty Professor, there's so many movies that he's done. He's become a good friend, but he always talks about the root, educato, is to draw out, to inspire. And so when you talk about education, it's not just pouring in. Yeah. It's how do you ultimately create this thirst for knowledge, and to your point, this curiosity where you want to go out and learn and be a part of it.
Right. Yeah. When I was a teacher in the classroom, I used to, as I got later in my career, I realized that my purpose in in teaching wasn't to teach kids, it was to get them to a point where they no longer needed me. And that was a really rewarding, although it's kind of a hard pill to swallow, when you realize your students have so vastly outpaced your ability to teach them. It can be a very humbling experience, but it's also really wonderful in the sense that they've reached that point where they're ready for that next place, and they're also hopefully doing things on their own to fulfill their need and their desire to continue to learn. And it's very much the same thing at the Science Center. Had a number of conversations going through the Dallas project of what really do we want in terms of a result when a visitor walks away from the building. What do we want? And there are a lot of different ways to answer that question, but for me, one of the biggest things is I'm less interested that they walk away knowing a lot of scientific facts. I mean, we'll present facts and we're very clear on what those things are. I'm more interested in folks walking away with a lot of questions, and we want them not only to have those questions that they can ask, but quite frankly, to learn how to ask questions. That's one of the things that, in my experience working with kids, they struggle with, and it's a skill that they would greatly benefit from. We don't want them just to be taskmasters. We don't want people just to be these rote memorizers of factual information that they can regurgitate with a purpose that's really indiscernible to them. We want them to be voracious consumers of learning, and we want them to be these curious minds that go out and wrestle with big challenges and have the confidence to take them on. That's what we want. And if we want to do that, we have to shift the whole way of thinking about the Science Center and the purpose of that thing. We are not there to be the sort of repository of all information. We're not the Alexandrian Library. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is to ignite that spark and then help them understand what that future can look like for them and help them move into that area of curiosity.
What advice would you give to a business leader, business owner, entrepreneur in terms of kind of carrying that same idea is searching for their relevance, searching for how do you create something different and really enable people and empower people? How do you create a different experience? How do you shift, in other words? And in many cases, you have some large companies that are going through this process of finding their relevance and trying to shift, and others you have small startups that are trying to find their relevance and create new opportunities. So what advice would you give in terms of just finding relevance and creating a shift? I mean, maybe it's questions that you've asked that you think these are good questions that I think people need to ask to do some soul searching. What's a bit of advice you have on that front?
Well, a lot of it from my standpoint, and it's hard to call it advice, it's just the process that we've sort of gone through, is spending that time certainly to understand what the community values, so at least we know when we start moving in a given direction that it will be received well. But quite frankly, the majority of change that really happens is beneath the surface. It's not visible to the public, right? The majority of that change is internal. And especially now at the Adventure Science Center, when we're looking at an 8 to 10 year trajectory of completely transforming the Science Center, we talk a lot about the first and the greatest bulk of change will be internal. It will be a cultural mindset shift of, yes, we need to change, but then also the way that we're going to go about change is to involve everybody and empower everybody to come up with ideas, to participate in what that change ultimately looks like. It is not a top-down approach. My greatest ability inside that Science Center is to enable everyone in that space to have an idea and to have value and to bring their communities into this conversation as well. You know, we talk a lot about this thing called an idea engine, and we try to build the biggest one possible. You know, we try to bring as many people into that ideation mindset, whether it's around a given exhibit or really that 10-year vision for us, until where we feel like it's starting to become a little chaotic and a little too noisy, and then that's kind of when we pull back a little bit. We try to pull as many people into that conversation as possible. We try to push decision making as deep into the organization as possible, really to free up a lot of the creative thinking at some of the higher levels of the organization, so to speak. But we really don't take a top-down approach. It's enabling everybody and challenging everyone that they're all responsible for ultimately what we're going to become. I happen to be the person that is lucky enough to get out into the community a lot and talk about the vision, but ultimately it's not mine. It's built very, very purposely with a lot of other people's input in mind. So,
before we switch over and do a lightning round, which is just short questions, short answers, give us one teaser for, I mean, obviously you've already teased us a little bit, but give us something upcoming that you're excited about that you think everyone should be paying attention to.
So can I share two things then?
Sure.
All right. So on the immediate horizon, we have a Waylake Playdate. And again, as I said, we want to be this science center for all ages. And so we've spent a lot of time really creating some super cool programs for the 21 and up set. So if folks have kids, great. If they don't have kids, great. But we want to make sure that the adults feel welcome inside the Science Center. And so Waylake Playdate is coming up soon. And those are quarterly events for 21 and up. I believe the next one, my marketing team will kill me if I get this wrong, I believe the next one is for Harry Potter, is the theme. So we bring in all different kinds of vendors and partners, and we sort of pull back a little bit of the science around this topic of magic and Harry Potter, which is super cool. And if people want to geek out and dress up,
I was about to say, I guarantee people are going to show up with capes and all sorts of good stuff.
Yeah, you never know where you'll find your picture on
Harry
the website
Potter
too.
wand.
Yeah. No, people totally get into it.
Oh,
That's super cool. That's
believe me, like I said, I was at Universal, and oh my goodness, man, that's no joke.
Yeah, it's a serious deal. Yeah. So there's that.
What's the second one?
We pick a lot of pop culture themes to do that with, but those have been fantastic events, and have been really nice to see the adult community embrace this in that way. A little bit longer term, again, I've mentioned it a couple of times. We've got Soundbox coming, which is a 2,500 square foot exhibit all around music and sound. And that has been a really fun project to be designing over the last 8 months. When it opens, these will be the only exhibits of their kind in the country, and they'll be ours. And so there's nothing better than not only connecting with an idea that's central to that identity of Nashville, but doing it in a way that's totally unique to us, that
Absolutely.
we can be proud of, and we get to brag about that a little bit, and that's super cool.
So let's switch over and do lightning round. So short questions, short answers. But let's start with give us a favorite. I mean, you mentioned sitar, but give me either a band or a favorite CD or album or song, or what's something you listen to often. Let's put it that way.
REM, Life's Rich Pageant. That's my favorite band and my favorite CD, album, cassette of theirs. Yeah.
Have you seen them live?
I have seen them live. Yeah, I saw them on the Monster Tour in 1995. So
nice, very nice.
A little later than I had hoped, but I got there eventually.
Yeah, hey, absolutely. All right, so recent movie you've watched?
Recent movie I watched Deadpool 2 the other day. That's a great film. Those are just a lot of fun.
Yeah, those are hilarious too. All right, what's a recent book you've read?
A recent book I've read. So I do a lot of reading in a genre that some might not find all that fascinating, but I love Richard Feynman. He was one of, again, a great science communicator, and he's just a brilliant mind. And I do read some, nonfiction and fiction as a mix, but generally speaking, I tend to go with a lot of the nonfiction stuff. I really just love a good book about science and science stories. So,
what do you like to do to relax?
So I've got 2 kids at home, and so I love to play with them. Sometimes that counts as relaxing. Otherwise, typically we'll head down to the beach along the Florida Panhandle, and then we'll just kind of go sit on the beach in the sand and let time and the ocean flow by.
Nice. I'm jealous. My wife can sit there in the sand. I cannot. My attention span is I have to play with the kids. So usually if we're out, I get tired at the beach versus relaxing at the beach. What do you like to do when people come and visit Nashville? Where do you like? I mean, obviously you take them to the Adventure Science Center, but where else do you like to take them?
It's actually sort of fun to drive around downtown. There's just a fun, cool energy about that. And even if we don't stop, it's just nice to see a really thriving, energetic space. It's just sort of fun to tap into that energy, even if you're just kind of driving through it. I love driving around the southern parts of the city, especially the Natchez Trace. It's just extraordinary. And one of the things that is so cool to me about Nashville, and again reminds me a little bit of Austin, is the fact that you have this really thriving, vibrant hub at the core, but then 10, 15 minutes outside of that, you really are in these wonderful, beautiful rolling hills, and I'm drawn to that, and that's something that I think is very cool. And I know that Nashville is in that sort of moment now where they're trying to figure out how they preserve a lot of that green space and maintain that dual identity of a big city and really urban in some ways, but then also very much connected to nature. But I love being able to get into that in some of the parks, Percy Warner and Radnor and whatnot. So those are always big highlights.
What on your end is a tradition? It can be with your family or even with your parents, but what's a tradition that you enjoy?
So if I can mention two, I'll mention two. I love going to Thanksgiving out in California with my dad, who's there, and my sister and her husband that come down from the Bay Area. That's always just a nice week to get out there and reconnect with family, which is fun. And then one of the other traditions that is something hopefully I'll get to repeat again this year. For about the last 15 years, more often than not, I'm able to do a nice canoe trip down the Rio Grande near Big Bend National Park in Texas. It's obviously on the Texas-Mexico border. And we just pack up a canoe and we spend about 3 days paddling down in the middle of nowhere and hope our car's there at the end when we get to the takeout. And there's just nothing quite like that. I mean, you totally unplug, you totally disconnect. We usually sleep on the Mexican side of the river and light some fireworks and have some fun, and it's cool.
And then to wrap up, I mean, obviously you're creating your legacy. I mean, you're still early on, especially with the Adventure Science Center. But what do you hope, many, many years from now, what do you hope that people say about your legacy, especially with the Adventure Science Center, but here in Nashville, what do you hope that people say about you and your time here and your impact and efforts?
That's a great question. My at the end of the day, when I look at the seat that I'm fortunate to sit in and look at the role that I have an opportunity to play, and I'm very grateful for, my role is to make sure that the museum is there in 100 years and that it's better than it is today. And maybe that sounds obvious and trite, but ultimately that's it, is whenever that time comes for me to move on to that next thing, I want to be able to look back and know that that we were able to do some really great things, and that ultimately we created a science center that is so fundamentally deeply connected to the community that the community cannot imagine life without it. That's really what it's all about. Because we, again, as I said, we can be that place. We should be that place. Nashville deserves it. Great cities have great science museums. I know that's also been said about the library, but I firmly believe that about science centers. When you look at world-class cities across the United States, but also certainly around the globe, they have great cultural institutions, and that's a lot of what defines them as such.
Right.
And we have an opportunity to create that here, and we shouldn't miss that. So that's my big thing. I want to make sure that we've done that, and we've created something truly unique and special that the city loves.
Well, the last question is always the easiest, is just how do we get in touch? So talk about website, social media, how do we learn more? I mean, obviously, you can even mention the address if you want, but where do we go to learn more about the Adventure Science Center?
Well, you can always come visit us at 800 Fort Negley Boulevard. We're right next to Fort Negley, very close to downtown, so it's a great place to be, and especially if folks are in town to, maybe catch a show or maybe a Predators game or something like that. It's a lot of fun to make a full day of coming and hanging around that space. AdventureSci.org is the website, and that really is probably the best place to go for information in terms of what's coming up. There is a constantly evolving set of programs and new events that are on our horizon. So I strongly encourage folks to jump on that. You can see the calendar a pretty good ways out and start to plan out some of those fun weekends, whether it's getting ready for the first Saturday that kicks off our monthly theme, or we've got a cool Touch-a-Truck event coming up where the parking lot's going to be full of these gigantic construction trucks that people will be able to not only look at, but you can climb up and get into them, talk to the operators, all that kind of stuff. So AdventureSci.org is the best place to go to find that out. And then, of course, social media, we're throughout, Facebook, Instagram, all of that.
Make it easy to find you.
Yeah, we try. And we've got a great marketing team that has done a wonderful job building that visibility. So.
Well, Steve, you and your team, you're definitely ChangeMakers. We greatly appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing not only your efforts, but also to the kind of lifting the veil behind the scenes so people can understand the strategy and what all goes into the decision-making process, but ultimately, how do you create change? So we greatly appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the ChangeMakers podcast, produced by City Current and powered by Lipscomb & Pitts Insurance. To learn more about our guests and to share your stories of others leading by example, visit us online at citycurrent.com. Connect with us online using @citycurrent or follow the conversation using the hashtag ChangeMakers. Now, think big, start small, and act now. Be a changemaker.